Dad, this banana is too large. I can't finish it. Hello, everyone. My name is Emma. I'm 24 years old and I live with my father. I've been an orphan since I was very young because my mother passed away from a serious illness, leaving only my dad and me to rely on each other. My childhood was filled with love and constant care from my dad. His name is William, and he took on both parental roles, doing his best to compensate for the absence of my mother. Life was calm and familiar until one day everything changed. It all started when I turned 18 and entered university, a moment that marked a significant shift in my life, signaling my growth and my step into the broader world. I still remember the sense of confusion when I left my beloved home and my father's protective embrace, facing a new life full of uncertainties. I was just a simple girl at the time, unaware of the complexities of love and relationships, with a pure heart full of curiosity and a desire to explore, eager to learn all the new things university would bring. In the early days, everything was fresh and exciting. I made friends from different places, sharing unforgettable stories and memories, surrounded by the energy of the lecture halls and the noise of the dorm. There were times, though, when I missed home deeply. Whenever I thought of my father, a wave of longing would wash over me as I recalled him taking care of me, telling stories about my mother on quiet evenings. His eyes were always filled with love, though tinged with sadness, and that image stayed with me. Everything seemed to be progressing smoothly until that fateful day, a day I can never forget. That was the day my life shifted completely, changing everything I had known. It marked not just a transition into adulthood, but also a major test of everything I had believed. I was no longer the innocent girl who only knew joy and simple things. That day, I began confronting complex emotions and situations I was unprepared for. At university, I met friends who were just like me, fresh to university life. However, they weren't like me. They were more worldly, familiar with bars, parties, and the complexities of relationships. We lived together in a small dorm room, cramped but filled with laughter and endless stories. Initially, I was shy and unfamiliar with their world, but over time, I found myself becoming more involved in their activities. On weekends, our room buzzed with energy as my friends put on makeup, chose their best outfits, and played loud music from their phones. Their excitement drew me in, and before long, I didn't want to miss out. At first, I participated out of curiosity, wanting to experience things I had never known. I vividly remember my first time at a bar with them, excited but confused, stepping into a room lit with flashing lights and filled with loud music and laughter. I stood by them, sipping the cocktail my friend handed me, feeling the bitterness slowly spread. Over time, nights like those became routine. From being an observer, I started enjoying the lively atmosphere, dancing with my friends, and joining in the fun. I learned how to drink too, starting with small glasses and gradually progressing to finishing entire drinks without hesitation. I recall the late nights returning to the dorm, laughing with wobbly legs, sharing funny stories about the night. The feeling of freedom and rebellion made me feel more alive than I had ever felt. I wasn't the innocent girl I had been when I first arrived at university. I had crossed a line I hadn't even considered. From these parties, I also learned about love, a concept that had always been unclear to me. One night at a classmate's birthday, I met someone new. His smile and eyes made my heart race. For the first time, I felt the true essence of love. We stayed up late, sending long messages, sharing personal stories and dreams for the future. Love came to me in an unexpected and captivating way. The first year of university flew by. I could see how much I had changed since I first arrived. No longer the shy girl focused only on studying and simple dreams, I had become someone who knew how to enjoy life, savor the taste of wine, and feel the passion of music deep in my soul. When the year ended, we all said goodbye, each carrying memories of our time together. The dorm grew quieter as our roommates left for the summer, and I felt an emptiness without the late-night outings or the long stories in the dark. This made me realize how much I had gotten used to that lifestyle. Everything started anew when I returned home. As I stepped into the house, I saw my father sitting on the couch, watching TV, unaware of my return. I decided to sneak up on him and surprise him. I quietly crept closer, planning to scare him, but just as my hand was about to touch his shoulder, he suddenly turned, grabbed my hand, and pulled me into his embrace. "You came back without telling me," he said warmly. We both laughed, filled with joy and surprise. I asked how he knew I was coming, and he pointed to the mirror next to the TV. I turned and saw that the mirror reflected my every move, so he knew what I was doing all along. I couldn't help but laugh, embarrassed and amused at the same time. Dad laughed too, his eyes filled with the warmth and love I had always known. After a while, I told him I needed to get my suitcase and head to my room. He smiled and nodded, still gentle. I went to get my things, feeling the peace of the house and the love that filled it. The afternoon was quiet, but it felt alive with my dad's presence. That evening, we sat down for dinner. I shared stories from my first year of school, and we laughed together. At times, he would look at me with loving eyes. It was then that I realized something. My dad was actually quite handsome. Despite being nearly 50, he still had the body of a young man, likely due to his love for exercise and the physically demanding work he did. He wore a tank top, which revealed his strong muscles, and I found myself noticing his strength and beauty in a new way. As I stared at him, my thoughts became jumbled, and I was suddenly interrupted by my father's voice. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I quickly smiled, shaking my head. "Nothing," I replied. We shared a moment of mutual understanding, both of us realizing how much had changed. He smiled and said, "You've changed a lot in just 1 year." I nodded, smiling back. "You've grown up, Dad," I replied. That night, as I lay in bed, the image of my father's muscular frame stayed with me, and I felt confused. I never expected to have such thoughts about him, but that image stayed in my mind, even when I closed my eyes. The next day, the heat of midday was unbearable. I sat in the living room, sweating, unable to cool off despite fanning myself with my hand. My father had left early that morning to handle some work and only returned at noon. The oppressive heat made everything feel like it was burning. I couldn't stand it any longer and decided to take a shower. The cool water was a welcome relief, washing away the heat and frustration. I felt a sense of comfort, so much so that I forgot everything around me, including the bathroom door, which I hadn't closed. The water ran over me, soothing the burn in my body, and I closed my eyes, letting the calmness take over. As I relaxed, I thought back to those moments when I would sneak peeks at my father while he worked, admiring him from afar. Since arriving at university, my feelings for him had changed. What I once saw as admiration slowly turned into a more intense, unexplainable emotion. Suddenly, I felt a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and froze. There, standing in the doorway, was my father, his eyes fixed on me. He hadn't made a sound, and I hadn't noticed when he had entered. His expression was a mix of surprise and something I couldn't quite define. My heart raced, and I found myself unable to move. The tension was palpable, and the only sound was the running water. It felt like time had stopped. In that moment, we both realized that something had changed between us. The silence was broken when I spoke, my voice trembling. "Dad, you're back." He was startled, blinking rapidly as if waking from a dream. His voice was shaky as he apologized, but the blush on his cheeks couldn't be hidden. We both stood there, the air heavy, the sound of water still trickling as a reminder that we were standing on the edge of something forbidden. I gripped my hands, feeling the cool sensation of water droplets falling to the floor, trying to suppress the swirling emotions that were rising within me. A light breeze from the half-open window brushed past me, making me shudder involuntarily. This feeling was both embarrassing and unbearable. He looked at me once more, our eyes meeting like an unspoken confession, before he turned and hurried back into the living room. The space around us returned to silence, but my heart continued to pound, a mixture of confusion and chaotic thoughts filling my mind. After a while, I emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around me with water still glistening on my damp skin. The misty steam from the bathroom drifted out, mixing with the hot air of the sultry afternoon. As I walked into the living room, my heart raced when I saw him. William was sitting there, his shirt soaked with sweat, clinging to his body. Our eyes met for a brief moment before he quickly looked away, as if it was impossible to look at me directly. No longer the innocent girl I once was, I suddenly felt an irresistible boldness. I smiled and walked closer to him, each step heavy with desire. I sat down right next to him, so close that his breath brushed against my cheek. "Did you see everything just now?" I whispered with a half smile, as if it was just a trivial story. William stiffened. his brown eyes glowing with a fiery intensity in the living room light. His face stretched with shyness and awkwardness. He faltered, struggling to find the right words. Dad, Dad, it's not, he mumbled, his hands gripping the front of his shirt in an attempt to hide the rising tension. Our eyes met again, and I saw the struggle between reason and emotion. Don't avoid me, I said softly, my eyes locked onto his for a long moment. The space between us seemed frozen. He swallowed dryly, opening his mouth to say something but stopped. We both knew that the line between right and wrong was blurring. William took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on my shoulders. This won't do, he said, his voice low, more to himself than to me. But I didn't let him stop. A strange, powerful sensation spread through my body. His eyes hesitated, but there was no clear rejection. I couldn't hold myself back anymore. My hands reached up and cupped William's face, pulling him closer. I planted a kiss on his trembling lips. The surprise made him stiffen, but only for a moment. After a second, I felt his lips respond, soft but passionate. Our breaths mingled, and I knew that the invisible bond between us had broken. William no longer hesitated. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into an embrace with such force that I could feel his heartbeat. The outside world faded away, leaving only us and the sensations of the present, the pounding of our hearts. Each surge of heat as William ran his hands through my wet hair. I shouldn't have, he whispered one last time. But his voice was drowned by emotion. I didn't answer, only stared deeply into his eyes, where the light of surrender shone. A second later, we were lost in a longer, more passionate kiss. All inhibitions and reason were swept away. From that moment, all boundaries between us vanished. We rushed into each other without hesitation, as if the outside world no longer existed. In the days that followed, the house became our private space, where all fears and reservations disappeared. Every time he entered the room, his burning gaze made my heart race. I could feel every rapid breath, every strong movement from him, as if he wanted to leave an imprint of himself on me. At first, the fear of being discovered still lingered, but gradually, passion erased all worries. We lived in a crazy whirlwind of desire. Each encounter was a moment to lose ourselves in inseparable emotions. He knew how to make me forget everything, taking me to the peak of pleasure I had never known. The house no longer felt quiet. It had transformed into a place that witnessed the most intense, passionate moments between us. Days passed, and every afternoon, when the soft sunlight filtered through the window, I would wait for him to come home. Every sense in me was awakened when I heard his footsteps. The anticipation made my heart flutter. We didn't just meet in the dark. In the mornings, our eyes met meaningfully. I knew I was deeply in love and couldn't turn back. We continued like that, holding each other tightly through every moment until I finished college. It felt as though time had stopped, leaving only the two of us to share the burning secrets of our house. And now, I don't know if I can ever go back to the way things were. The life I once knew, the life I once considered peaceful, was swept away by this intense relationship. I felt like a person lost in the chaos of emotions and memories, no longer sure of what was right or wrong. Looking back, I wonder if I can ever regain the innocence and simplicity of those days, or if the scars from them will follow me. Here's my advice to everyone. Don't fall for temptations that can appear in your life from anywhere and anyone. Moments of impulsiveness may bring fleeting joy, but the price you pay might be your peace of mind and your future. When you find yourself at a crossroads between reason and emotion, ask yourself if it is worth trading the important values you have built. Cherish what you have and think carefully before committing to something that could lead to regret. Don't let short-term moments overshadow the long-term future. Intense emotions can easily make us forget the long-term consequences. The sustainability of relationships is built on trust, loyalty, and sincerity. Every decision carries consequences, and a nagging conscience is the hardest to heal. Think about the people around you, the people who love you, and yourself. Don't trade your peace of mind for a moment of impulsiveness. Emotions are beautiful, but they can easily lead you astray if not controlled. Be clear-headed and strong in every decision you make. I'm Lily, 30 years old. I want to share a past that I've kept hidden for many years because it was too painful and hard to accept. There are things in life that we never imagined would happen to us, but they still come and change everything. I never thought I would have to live in torment because of a truth that, even now, is hard for me to accept. My story isn't about love or family happiness as people might think, but about difficult choices and hidden emotions. People say that love is the only reason two people get married. But in the case of my mother and stepfather, I knew that wasn't the case from the first time he appeared. I felt something was off, and gradually I realized that my mother was just an excuse. I was the real reason he married her. My mother, Ya, owned a small fashion shop after my father passed away when I was young. She raised and cared for me until I became an adult with her resilience and determination. Not only did she take care of us, but she also grew her fashion store into a well loved place. My mother has always been a symbol of strength and independence in my eyes. Life went on steadily and peacefully, with my mother continuing to run the fashion shop while I focused on my studies. As time went by, I entered a transitional phase in my life when I started university. It was the first time I felt like I had truly escaped my mother's protective embrace and stepped into the wider world. The early days of university brought many new experiences. Then, one day, I met Mr. Matthew, who was not just my teacher, but also my future stepfather. Mr. Matthew was a philosophy lecturer, and from the very first day of class, I was captivated by the way he taught. He not only deepened my understanding of the subject, but also changed my perspective on life. Our after class conversations became more frequent, and I realized that he had a significant influence on me. However, over time, I began to notice something strange in his eyes when he looked at me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as time passed, this feeling became clearer and clearer. There were moments when I spoke, and he looked at me not just as a teacher to a student, but with a deeper gaze, as if there was something unspoken. This gaze held a sense of intimacy and silence, full of hidden meanings, and it made me uncomfortable every time it appeared. It was not the kind of gaze I was used to, but one that seemed to examine me, as if he was expecting something from me that I couldn't understand. I wondered if I was imagining too much, but the discomfort only grew. As time went on, not only did Mr. Matthews' gaze become more intense, but his actions did as well. Every time I spoke or simply walked by, he would stand closer to me, sometimes placing his hand on my shoulder in a way that made me uneasy. At first, these gestures seemed harmless, but they soon began to feel heavy, making me uncomfortable. Once, he kept me after class to discuss the lecture, but the conversation wasn't like the others. He didn't just talk about the subject, he seemed to want to prolong the meeting. His unnecessary gaze and the intimacy felt suffocating, and I no longer felt the respect and distance that should exist between a teacher and a student. Gradually, I started to avoid him, making up excuses to avoid private conversations after school. When he offered help, I would refuse, claiming to be busy. But the truth was, I just wanted to keep my distance. I attempted to position myself further away in class, limiting eye contact, and occasionally even deliberately avoided it. I would arrive at school late, hoping to miss any interaction with him before the lessons began. I believed that if I kept my distance from Mr. Matthew, everything would eventually settle. I thought that if I didn't face his uncomfortable gazes and behavior, I might be able to forget the anxiety that overwhelmed me for the remainder of the year. As I tried to avoid him, things seemed to return to normal, and I convinced myself that the troubles were behind me. However, I had no idea that the sense of safety I created for myself would only be temporary. A year after the school year ended, I came home to notice something different about my mother. She seemed much more cheerful than usual, her eyes glowing with excitement whenever she spoke, and occasionally I heard her laugh softly as if she were hiding a deep joy. I was curious, but my mother simply told me she was happy because life had been improving. Then one afternoon, while we were sitting together in the living room, my mother suddenly sat beside me, her face glowing, her eyes full of an undeniable joy. She shared something important. She had met someone special and wanted me to meet him. Seeing her happiness in every gesture made my heart rejoice as well. My mother had raised me alone for so many years, sacrificing her own happiness to care for me. I felt relieved that she had finally found the joy and contentment she deserved. The day my mother was set to introduce this man to me, I felt excitement building. The house was in perfect order, and my mother had carefully set the dining table. I could see the anticipation in her eyes, and I hoped this man would bring her the comfort and happiness she had longed for. When the doorbell rang, my heart skipped a beat. My mother quickly went to answer it, while I stood in the living room, wondering about the man who was about to enter her life. When the door opened and I saw that the person walking in was Mr. Matthew, My heart sank in shock. I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. All the discomfort I had previously felt about him came rushing back, overwhelming me. The man my mother loved, the man she introduced to me with such trust and joy, was the very person I had been trying to avoid. A whirlwind of conflicting thoughts filled my mind. Why him? How did they meet? Did he have ulterior motives? The unease in my chest grew as memories of his strange looks and unpleasant actions flooded back, making it hard to think clearly. I looked at my mother, hoping to find some indication that she recognized how strange the situation was, but she seemed completely unaware, still smiling as she introduced Matthew as if everything were perfectly normal. To me, it felt like the debut of the man she loved, unaware of the storm brewing in my heart. Mr. Matthew walked in with a calm smile, looking friendly and polite. He greeted me and feigned surprise at discovering I was my mother's daughter. I tried to play along, pretending to be just as surprised, but inside, I was in turmoil. My mother, oblivious to the chaos in my mind, laughed and was thrilled to find out that Matthew had been my teacher. The two of them chatted happily, discussing this unexpected twist, while I stood silently, a sense of insecurity clinging to me. I couldn't stop questioning who Mr. Matthew truly was and why he had entered my mother's life in this completely different role than I had known. Was it really a coincidence, or was there something I hadn't noticed? From that point, everything appeared to go back to normal. There were no further oddities from Matthew, and I began to believe that my worries were unwarranted. Mom and Matthew grew closer, their feelings becoming more genuine. I saw my mother happier than ever, smiling brightly and glowing each day. Not long after, Mom decided to marry Matthew, officially making him my stepfather. Everything seemed to unfold smoothly, with no unusual events to disrupt our family life. As time went on and nothing out of the ordinary occurred, I started to think that maybe I had been overthinking. Perhaps my initial concerns had been born out of stress from dealing with the changes in my mother's life and my own. Seeing my mother so happy, I let go of my doubts and insecurities. I realized that the most important thing was that she had finally found the happiness she deserved. Eventually, I accepted their relationship and gave them my heartfelt blessing, hoping my mother would continue to live in joy. As time passed, I saw no signs that anything was wrong with Matthew as I had feared. Slowly, I began to feel guilty for letting unfounded anxieties cloud my thoughts. Seeing how content my mother was with Matthew, I too felt relieved. Eventually, I was genuinely happy for my mother and sincerely wished her well, hoping her life would remain full of joy and happiness. I thought everything was settled, that life would continue without any further issues. I hadn't seen any unusual signs from Matthew for a long time, and I began to feel reassured, no longer worrying or doubting my stepfather. He had been nothing but good to my mother and our family, and I believed that my earlier concerns were simply the result of my sensitivity and imagination. When I turned 22, I graduated from university and began searching for my first job. Though I hadn't found a perfect position, I decided to help my mother at her fashion store. We spent more time together, and Matthew would often stop by, assisting with small tasks when he had free time. Everything was still going smoothly, and I had no more doubts about Matthew. I truly believed he was a good husband to my mother and had become a part of my life as well. But then, on the worst day of my life, everything changed. I was feeling ill that day, my fever leaving me too exhausted to accompany my mother to the store. She told me to stay home and rest, which I thought nothing of. Only Matthew was home with me that day since he didn't have to go out. At first, I had no reason to worry or suspect anything. After all, I had lived with him for years, trusting him as a good and trustworthy person who loved my mother deeply. I lay in my room, trying to fall asleep to escape the pain of the fever. But that peace was short-lived. What I never imagined would happen, happened that very day. Matthew came into my room with a glass of water and some pills. He said they were painkillers to help reduce my fever quickly. His voice was gentle and kind, giving me no reason to doubt him. The fever had made my head dizzy, and I didn't question it. I just wanted to sleep, so I took the pills without hesitation, drinking the water as he had suggested. Everything seemed normal at first, and I didn't notice anything strange. The medicine didn't seem to take effect immediately, and I remained fully aware of my surroundings, lying quietly, thinking the fever would subside soon. However, about 20 minutes later, things began to change. Matthew returned, this time without any medication or water. There was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. When I tried to sit up, I was horrified to find that my body could no longer move. A feeling of paralysis spread through me, as if my strength had been drained away. Panic surged within me as I struggled to escape the helplessness, but I could do nothing but lie there, wide-eyed. Matthew walked closer, his face calm but his eyes sending a chill down my spine. I tried to move, but my body felt completely paralyzed, unable to obey my will. The helplessness was terrifying, but the fear grew stronger when Matthew leaned down, his face just inches from mine, and he smiled. His smile was no longer warm and gentle, but cold and sinister. Then he whispered, his voice soft yet clear, "I have waited for this opportunity for a long time." I was horrified, unable to comprehend what he had just said. My mind raced as I tried to understand what was happening, but it all seemed to fall apart. The worries and doubts that had plagued me before now became horrifyingly real. I realized that the nightmare I had once thought was only in my imagination had become my terrifying reality. Matthew sat next to me, his eyes filled with calculation, his smile twisted and sinister. I remained helpless, unable to move or resist, listening as he revealed his plan. He explained that ever since I had entered college, he had developed feelings for me and had been trying to get closer to me. He had noticed my attempts to keep my distance and had failed to approach me in the ways he had hoped. My avoidance had led him to choose another route, getting closer to me through my mother. He spent time gaining my mother's trust and gradually becoming her husband. Before I knew it, he was a part of my family, and I had no idea it had all been orchestrated to get closer to me. Hearing all of this, I felt like I was falling into an abyss. I couldn't believe that everything around me had been carefully planned. What I had thought were normal events, like my mother's happiness, now felt like a facade, a manipulation to achieve the ultimate goal of getting close to me. I was filled with disgust and pain as I realized that everything from the beginning had been part of his sick scheme. After he finished speaking, Matthew leaned closer, his eyes now full of satisfaction as he saw me lying motionless. His eyes, once so kind and friendly, now radiated greed and coldness. I tried to shrink back, but I couldn't move. Every attempt to shift felt futile, as if my body no longer obeyed me. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body was paralyzed. Then Matthew leaned down, his hands moving over me, sending waves of disgust through me. He took control, his actions merciless. I could do nothing but lie there, trapped, feeling each moment as it unfolded. The second he took me felt like it stretched on endlessly, and all I could do was wish for it to stop. But no, he didn't relent. It felt as if everything around me was crumbling, and the calm I once had was ripped away by him. I wanted to fight back, to struggle, but it was useless. Matthew didn't stop, and I could feel my body slipping out of my control. Time felt like it was dragging, every second turning into a nightmare with no escape. I lay there, powerless, staring at the ceiling, trying to dissociate from reality, but everything continued, slow and agonizing. The sense of paralysis, the feeling of losing control, made my fear intensify with every passing second. Every touch, every movement from him was like a blow to my self-worth and dignity. Pieces of me broke apart, and I couldn't stop it. My body didn't feel like it was mine anymore. He had completely taken over. Everything was happening in slow motion, and all I could do was lie there, living in terror, unable to resist. Each moment felt like hours, and I just wished for it to end. When it finally did, I lay there, hollow and numb. The room felt cold, suffocating, lifeless. Matthew stood, adjusting his clothes as if nothing had happened, while I remained still, trapped in the horror I had just endured. I felt my entire world crumble, all that I had known and believed fading into insignificance. My mind was filled with painful, angry questions I couldn't answer. How could the person my mother loved, the one I tried to accept as part of our family, do this to me? The pain, fear, and betrayal mixed into one overwhelming force, suffocating me, leaving me utterly helpless and despairing. Matthew glanced at me one last time, his eyes cold and unfeeling, then left the room, leaving me with all the hurt, the torment, and the disturbing thoughts consuming my mind. I had no idea how to face this new reality or how to move forward when everything had fallen apart. After some time, as the effects of the drugs slowly faded, I began to regain control over my body. Still weak and dizzy, I tried to stand. Every movement was painful, but I knew what I had to do. My hands trembled as I tried to straighten my clothes, attempting to conceal the signs of the horror I had just gone through. My eyes landed on the phone on the table. It was my only way to call for help and end this nightmare. Weakly, I made my way toward it, my hands still shaking as I dialed 911. Each number became more difficult to press. When the operator's voice came through, I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my voice steady, and spilled it all out. The police arrived quickly, but to me, it felt like an eternity. As they entered the house, the silence was broken by voices, hurried footsteps, and finally, Matthew's arrest. He didn't resist, just lowered his head as if he knew it was over. My mother returned shortly after, seeing me still trembling and weak, standing beside the police. At first, she didn't understand what was happening. When I looked into her eyes, all my strength vanished, and I could no longer hold back. Tears streamed down my face as I told her everything. My voice cracked as I explained what Matthew had done and the horrors I had endured. My mother was stunned, her eyes wide with confusion and sorrow. She didn't say a word the entire time I spoke, standing there as if her world had shattered. When I finished, she collapsed into tears, consumed with grief and regret. She blamed herself for not realizing something was wrong, for bringing someone like Matthew into our lives. In her agony, she repeated, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," over and over again. But I knew that no apology could undo the pain we were feeling. That day, everything changed forever. My mother couldn't forgive herself, and I couldn't return to the life I had before. After the police arrested Matthew, I felt a sense of relief. But the pain didn't vanish immediately. I had received justice for myself by confronting what he had done, but that didn't mean the torment would disappear. My mother, after hearing the whole truth, fell into deep remorse, blaming herself for trusting Matthew and not realizing his true nature. She decided to leave the house we had shared and close the store temporarily to find some peace. Matthew was convicted, and I knew I would never see him again, but that didn't erase the wounds in my heart. He had destroyed part of my life, and no matter how much time passed, the pain would remain like an unhealable scar. From these traumatic events, I learned that silence isn't the solution to pain or fear. Confronting the truth, no matter how excruciating, is the only way to heal. Hiding and keeping things to ourselves only prolongs the suffering. I also understood that even though my mother didn't know what had been happening, her trust in both Matthew and me had led to catastrophic consequences. Speaking up and sharing our feelings with loved ones is crucial. Had I been brave enough to voice my concerns when I suspected something was wrong with Matthew, perhaps things wouldn't have escalated like they did. Even though Matthew was punished and my mother realized her error, our lives never returned to what they were before. I had to learn to live with the pain and the memories of the past and find peace despite the scars that would never fully heal. As for my mother, she too had to find a way to forgive herself. Everything is still unfolding, and I can't predict what will happen next. But one thing is certain: I will no longer remain silent. I will continue moving forward no matter how hard it gets. The regret and pain may follow me, but I've begun the journey of healing, and though the road is long, I will not allow myself to be a victim of silence anymore. I will reclaim the strength I lost in that nightmare and rediscover who I am. The story I'm about to share with you is not an easy one. It's not a typical story, and it's certainly not one any of us would wish to live through. But it's a story about family, complicated relationships, and fragile boundaries. Sometimes the things we take for granted become unclear and confusing. This is the story of me and my daughter, Emily. Through small, seemingly insignificant moments, things shifted, and we found ourselves at a crossroads neither of us wanted to face. What brought us to this point? Is there a way back? I invite you to listen and feel with me. It was a quiet afternoon, the sun dipping behind the tall buildings, casting a warm orange light over our peaceful neighborhood. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, with the soft hum of the radio in the background. Emily had just returned from a weekend at college. The atmosphere in the house was calm, comfortable, and familiar. Emily had grown up so fast. It felt like just yesterday she was the little girl who followed me everywhere, asking endless questions. Now, at 21, she was no longer the little girl I remembered, but a confident, sometimes distant young woman. The dynamic between us had shifted as she matured, and I was still trying to adjust to that. Dinner was ready, and I called her to join me at the table. As we sat, I noticed a subtle difference in the way she looked at me, intense in a way that made me pause. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. We talked about her classes, her friends, and how much she missed home. But the way she lingered on my arm made me feel something I couldn't quite identify. After dinner, we decided to watch a movie together, something we used to do before she left for college. The living room felt cozier than usual, with soft lighting and cushions creating the perfect setting for a quiet night. I couldn't remember the last time we had such a peaceful evening together. As the movie played, I found myself glancing at her more than I should have, noticing how much she had changed. She was no longer the child I raised, but a grown woman. Then, just as I started feeling uneasy about the thoughts creeping into my mind, she moved closer on the couch. At first, I thought it was harmless, but then her hand brushed mine, and an electric shock ran through me as if something between us was out of place. A feeling I knew I shouldn't have had. I quickly pulled my hand away, startled by the intensity of it all. "What's wrong, Dad?" she asked, her voice soft and almost concerned. I looked at her, my heart racing, unsure of what to say or do. "Nothing, baby, I'm just tired," I replied, trying to brush it off and hoping she wouldn't notice the tension. But I knew something had shifted. There was something we couldn't ignore. The line between father and daughter had blurred, and though neither of us had crossed it, the air was heavy with unspoken words. We sat in silence, the movie playing in the background, but neither of us was really paying attention anymore. I got up, saying I needed to go to bed early, but as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't push away. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I was her father, nothing more. I loved her deeply, but not in a way that could be misunderstood. I was being unreasonable, I told myself as I walked downstairs. Emily was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a book. She greeted me with a smile, acting as though nothing had happened. Maybe it really was nothing, just an odd moment that only I noticed. "Good morning," I said, attempting to smile and sound as natural as possible. "Good morning, Dad," she replied, her voice gentle and kind. "I was thinking of going for a walk later. Would you like to join me? It's been a while since we've done something together." I hesitated for a moment, unsure if spending time alone with her after last night was a good idea. But then I told myself it was just a walk between a father and his daughter. Nothing wrong with that. "Sure," I answered, trying to keep the conversation light. "Sounds nice." That afternoon, we drove to a nearby park where Emily and I used to walk when she was little. The air was fresh and the sky was clear, and for a moment, everything felt normal. We walked side by side, chatting about nothing important. Old memories, her future plans, and daily gossip. I found myself smiling more, feeling at ease around her. Maybe I had overreacted the night before. Perhaps it was just a passing feeling. But as we wandered deeper into the park, there were moments when our conversation would pause, and silence filled the space, heavier than it should have been. The air felt thick with unsaid words and emotions I wasn't ready to face. At one point, when we reached a clearing with a beautiful view of the open lawn ahead, Emily stopped and turned to me. "You've always been there for me," she said, her voice soft but serious. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Her words stopped me. The way she spoke, the vulnerability in her tone, touched something deep inside me and made my heart ache. I tried to smile, to lighten the mood. "Don't worry about it," I joked. "Dad's not going anywhere." But she didn't smile. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes locking with mine. "No," she said. "I mean, you're more than a dad to me. You're everything to me." I froze. Her words hung in the air, full of meaning. I wasn't ready to confront this. I searched Emily's face for any sign that she was being sentimental, that this was just an innocent moment between father and daughter, but there was something in her eyes. A look I couldn't ignore. "Emily," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You know Daddy loves you, right? But not like that. Not in that way." "I know," she replied, her voice thick with emotion as she leaned closer. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Daddy." Panic rose in me, and my body felt frozen. This wasn't how a father and daughter should talk, shouldn't look at each other. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away before it spiraled out of control, but my body stayed still, unable to react. "We should go back," I said, my voice shaking. "It's getting late." Before I could turn away, Emily reached out and gently took my hand. The touch, though innocent, made my stomach tighten. Dad, she said, her voice full of something I couldn't quite name. I know this isn't right, but I can't control how I feel. Panic surged within me. I pulled my hand away, stepping back. Emily, we can't. This is wrong. You're my daughter, and we can't do this. She looked at me, her expression a mix of confusion and hurt. I'm not confused, Dad, she said, her voice steady. I know how I feel. I shook my head, feeling the pain inside me rise. This isn't right. You're my daughter, and we can't. I couldn't finish. The words seemed too heavy, too dangerous to say aloud. Emily took another step toward me, her eyes fixed on mine. I knew I had to do something to stop this before it went too far. We needed to maintain some distance for both of our sakes. We should go home, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. This isn't right, Emily. We shouldn't be like this. Emily paused, lowering her head slightly, her voice filled with disappointment. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered. I didn't mean to embarrass you like this. I took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions flooding my heart. It's okay, baby, I said softly, even though I knew it wasn't okay. We just need to keep some distance. We drove home in silence, the air between us thicker than ever. I knew things would never be the same again. A line had been crossed, and even though we hadn't crossed it physically, something had shifted forever. Once we got home, neither of us spoke. Emily went straight to her room, and I stood in the living room, looking around at the familiar surroundings. The house felt the same, but the weight in my chest made it feel eerily unfamiliar. Part of me wanted to rush to my room, talk to Emily, and try to clear the air, but I knew that would only make things worse. I sat down on the couch, my mind racing. Emily was my daughter, and I couldn't fathom how we had reached this point. Memories of her childhood flooded my mind. Those days when she ran around the house, laughing and playing, and I was always there, watching over her, ready to protect her from harm. Now, everything had changed. Emily was an adult, no longer the little girl I had known, but I was still her father. My love for her should have ended there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind consumed with questions and fears. What had made Emily feel this way? Had I been too close to her? Had I done something wrong in raising her? Our relationship, which should have been simple and innocent, had become complicated beyond imagination. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. I had hoped the weight of the previous day's emotions would fade, but instead, they only grew heavier. Emily had left the room without saying a word to me. The tension in the air was suffocating. While I was sitting at the dining table, Emily came downstairs, dressed neatly, clearly preparing to leave. I'll be back at school soon, she said, her voice calm, but I could hear the underlying worry. I nodded, not knowing what to say. Maybe that's for the best, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We need some space. She looked at me, her eyes full of sadness, but she didn't say anything more. Emily packed her things, and a few minutes later, she was ready to leave. I stood in the doorway, watching her walk to the car. My heart was heavy. Everything between us had changed forever. Have a safe trip, I said, my voice tight. She turned back to look at me, her eyes torn. Thanks, Dad, she whispered, then quietly got into her car and drove away. I stood there, watching her car disappear down the familiar drive. When she was gone, the house felt empty, eerily quiet. It was as if a part of the soul of the house had vanished, and I couldn't help but feel that I had lost something that couldn't be reclaimed. I knew that distance would give us time to think, to calm down, and to sort out our emotions, but I couldn't deny that things had gone too far. I didn't know if our relationship would ever be the same again. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to normal, but nothing felt the same. The house was too quiet without Emily, and I couldn't stop thinking about her. The memories of that moment, of her eyes, kept swirling in my mind. I wanted to believe that time and space would ease the pain, that the feeling would eventually fade. But deep down, I knew once something had changed, it could never go back to how it was before. Something between Emily and me had broken, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't fix it. One weekend afternoon, I received a text from Emily. She wrote that she was trying to work through her emotions, acknowledging that things weren't right and that she needed time to think. I read the message, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. Emily needed time, and so did I. Maybe with enough distance, we could rebuild our relationship. but perhaps it would never be the same. I sighed, closed my phone, and looked out the window. The city in the distance was peaceful, but my heart was not. Maybe only time would provide answers to the questions Emily and I couldn't face right now. My story is a lesson in the importance of maintaining clear boundaries in family relationships. As parents, we have a responsibility to care for and love our children unconditionally, but we must also recognize that love must be accompanied by respect and appropriate distance. There will be moments in life when we are confused, especially when relationships change over time, but it's crucial to stay grounded and set clear boundaries. I would advise anyone in a close relationship to maintain clarity about their roles. Don't let emotions blur the lines between father and child, mother and child, or any other important relationship. Small moments can lead to big issues if left unchecked. And once those issues arise, they are incredibly difficult to repair. The lesson I've learned is to always be smart, to know what's right and wrong, and to stop before things go too far. Respecting boundaries is the only way to protect the important relationships in our lives. Thank you for listening to my story, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.